Judge,
yeah.
You mentioned a national political figure who's decided to get involved. It sounds like you're talking about Trump, and then you said, I need your help. How can he help?
Well, one thing he could do is express support for reversing the deregulation that happened on his watch. I heard him say he had nothing to do with it, even though it was in his administration. So if he had nothing to do with it, and they did it in his administration against his will, maybe he could come out and say that he supports us moving in a different direction. We're not afraid to own our policies when it comes to raising the bar on regulation. And I've got to think that him indicating that this is something that everybody, no matter how much you disagree on politics and presidential campaigns, can get behind. Higher fines, tougher regulations on safety, Congress untying our hands on braking rules, all the other things that go with that, that'd be a nice thing for him to do.
This is Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg finally giving Donald Trump his due credit for his administration and party's focus on anti-environmentalism and deregulation in the aftermath of the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And to be clear, we won't know what specifically caused this derailment until the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, finishes its report. But let's remember that Donald Trump and the GOP have pushed openly and proudly for as much deregulation as possible. And don't just take my word for it.
When Americans are free to thrive, innovate, and prosper, there is no challenge too great, no task too large, and no goal beyond our reach. We are a nation of explorers and pioneers and innovators and inventors, and regulations have been hurting that and hurting it badly. We are a nation of people who work hard, dream big, and who never, ever give up. We are Americans, and the future belongs to us. So together, let's cut the red tape. Let's set free our dreams, and yes, let's make America great again. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by getting rid of a lot of unnecessary regulation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Come on over here, Chris. Come on over here. Why don't we all gather around? Come on. You're all such a big part of this. Come on. I think we can all make it. So this is what we have now. This is where we were in 1960. And when we're finished, which won't be in too long a period of time, we will be less than where we were in 1960, and we will have a great regulatory climate. Okay? Come on up here, Chris. Come on. You work so hard on this. Elaine, are you okay? Come on.
Yep.
You okay?
Yep, fine.
She has a lot to do with it. She has things called roads. That's a big, and bridges, right?
Yes.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
He'd even tweet stuff like this: I am continuing to get rid of costly and unnecessary regulations. Much work left to do, but effect will be great. Business and jobs will grow. And to his credit, that was one thing he didn't lie about. The Trump administration rolled back safety measures for railways, like regular safety audits and an Obama-era rule that required faster brakes on trains carrying flammable materials to prevent derailments and explosions. He ended a pending rule that would have required freight trains to have at least 2 crew members on board. Republicans urged the Federal Railroad Administration to expand the use of automated track inspection in the place of more effective visual human inspections. The Republican Study Committee proposed to cut government funding to address chemical spills. I mean, my God, we could sit here all day and list the ways that Trump and Republicans have deregulated the same industry that they're now having fainting spells over when it comes to regulation. As for the environmental aspects of this, now that Republicans are suddenly finding themselves out there hugging trees, just remember, Trump's EPA rolled back almost every regulation it could get its hands on. It repealed regulations intended to prevent chemical accidents at industrial facilities, and rolled back requirements for companies to regularly assess whether safer technologies have become available. It withdrew requirements that companies have third-party audits to determine the root causes of accidents. It implemented the Ineffective Toxic Substances Control Act, which was a knowingly inadequate effort to get the EPA to look at the risks of chemicals, but it included fatal flaws in its analyses. His EPA avoided studying the health risks of certain chemicals like asbestos. It overruled scientists on health assessments for PFAS, or forever chemicals, that contaminate our water. Trump tried to shutter the Chemical Safety Board, an agency that investigates accidents at industrial facilities, and Trump's appointees were industry professionals whose sole goal was to weaken regulations on the very industry they were charged with regulating. So when it comes to the GOP's newfound interest in protecting the environment, after not only sitting idly by, but participating as their party dismantled as many protections as they could, I'm sorry, but they can fuck all the way off. In fact, the deregulation during the Trump era was so pernicious that even Fox News acknowledged it on air.
Speaking of the White House, apparently regulations regarding train safety were changed during the Trump administration. This particular railroad and others lobbied President Trump to dismantle an Obama-era rule that would have required railroads to update their braking systems. And apparently the Obama administration had pushed for it to govern transportation of hazardous materials after about 500,000 barrels of crude were dumped. But ultimately, the Trump administration undid that and said the costs exceeded the benefits.
The very obvious, simple fact is that these railroad companies have been pushing against regulation for years, and Republicans and Trump supported them. And like I mentioned before, we won't know until this investigation is complete whether any specific regulation being stripped away was responsible for this derailment in Ohio, but this entire right-wing stance toward deregulation is what landed us here. Imagine for a moment if, instead of spending years rolling back safety standards, Republicans had bolstered them. Think about the ways this could have been prevented if we didn't constantly waste time re-implementing regulations only to watch them get stripped away by Republicans. If you want to talk about who's responsible here, it is the people whose job it is to regulate dangerous industries and yet opted instead to ignore that job because they were in bed with the executives who they were supposed to be regulating. And let's be clear, they know this. Republicans are not unaware of the fact that their entire governing philosophy has been to enable exactly this type of danger. And so to distract you from that, they're in overdrive right now working to make you think that Pete not going to East Palestine is the real issue here. That somehow a train derailing in an industry rife with deregulation and supported by a political party whose entire MO is more deregulation is the fault of the transportation secretary or any Democrat. This happened in Ohio, a state with a Republican governor, a Republican legislature, and at the hands of a train company that has donated overwhelmingly to Republicans. But sure, that's Pete's fault. Got it. Not for nothing, but something tells me that if a train derailed in a blue state, with a Democratic governor, with a Democratic legislature, with a train company that donated to Democratic politicians, that Republicans wouldn't suddenly be absolving all of them and blaming the federal government instead. It sure is funny that when there's crime, for example, in blue states, that's the fault of statewide Democrats. When there's crime in blue cities that are in red states, that's the fault of local Democrats. Starting to notice a trend here? And so now, when there's a train derailment in a red state, thanks to Republican deregulation, that's the federal government's fault. Lucky for Republicans, there's always someone else to blame. So instead of trying to make "why did Pete go to East Palestine so late?" the giant scandal here, the question should actually be, will you support regulations to prevent this from happening again? Will you introduce new regulations? Will you support the re-implementation of those regulations rolled back by Trump? Will you support fines for big railroad companies that avoid safety regulations? Will you require these companies to invest some of their record profits into safety? And the answer, of course, is no. They don't want substantive change. They just want the theatrics involved with vilifying a Democrat. And then they'll propose nothing, and it'll happen again, and we'll stay on this ride forever because Republicans aren't interested in fixing anything, but they'll sure jump at the chance to exploit a tragedy for some cheap political points. So the next time a Republican tries to take a cheap shot at Democrats because they want their 5-minute cable hit on Fox, ask yourself where they stand on the issues that actually landed us here in the first place. And then ask yourself what substantive solutions they're willing to propose to prevent it from happening again in the future. Because you and I know the answer to both of those questions, even if they're too ashamed to admit it. Before you go, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. You can click the thumbnail right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work even further, the best way is to subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. There you can check out my interviews with major players in the world of politics, including President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Katie Porter, Jamie Raskin, and so many more. Plus other interviews that live exclusively on the podcast. That link is also right here on this screen, or just search No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen wherever you listen to podcasts.